Thanks for coming out and watching the oxymoronic Reddit Professional Show, where I showcase the best and worst of the internet. Here I comment on brilliant and hilarious comment chains regarding dumb shit on the internet for you to enjoy. Make sure to subscribe, hit the little bell button so that you get notifications every time we come up with a new video. Enjoy this week's show. Doctors of Reddit, what made you say, "How are you still alive?" Pathologist here had a guy who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. I soon learned he was the recipient of a lung transplant about 15 years prior. When I opened the man up, his transplanted lung was upside down. I flipped the lung into the proper position, and bloop, it flipped right back to upside down. That was quite alarming. The surgeons who originally performed the transplant incorrectly attached the organ. When he by chance entered the correct position, the lung flipped over, causing his pulmonary artery to seal shut, resulting in his death. The man lived for 15 years with a lung that was dying to flip upside down, and it was only by sheer chance he didn't move in such a way that allowed it to do so until the fateful day of his death. It is one of the most fascinating cases I've ever witnessed. My dad's a doctor, so I asked him. When he was an intern in the ER, someone walked in the front door with a kitchen knife sticking out between his eyes to the handle. The knife went through his sinus cavity and ended with the tip in his throat, millimeters from his brainstem. He goes into surgery and walks out of the ICU the next day. My dad says he is the luckiest man he ever saw. Hemoglobin of 35, 3.5, in a 35-year-old guy with a chronic rectal bleed he refused to have looked into for months because he didn't want anyone looking at his bumhole. Finally brought to the ER by ambulance when he fainted, aka started dying, in a grocery store. Guy comes in with a bit of chest pain. Tells me the big coronary artery on the front of his heart was 100% blocked. I tell him, "Who told you that?" He says his doctor did about 10 years ago. I don't believe him since patients never, ever get any of the stuff their doctor tells them right. I let the cardiac surgeon know what this guy said, and he too goes, 100%? So he's dead? If the biggest coronary artery is totally occluded, and for 10 years no less, you're a dead man. Lo and behold, we get an angiogram, and it was fucking 100% occluded. The artery on the back of the heart made a connection with the front of the heart to pick up the slack. It was some lucky shit. I used to work as a clerk in diagnostic imaging at a hospital, and we had a man come in for an x-ray complaining of chest pain. His record shows his last visit was 2 years prior when he got drunk and fell into a fish tank, breaking it. ER stitched him up and sent him home. Fast forward 2 years, and we are all gathered around the computer screen, looking at an x-ray that showed a 12-inch long piece of fish tank glass sitting in his chest with his aorta resting right on top of it. It was on an angle running from his left shoulder down towards his right hip. There were other shards of glass too, but this one was the biggest. Emergency surgery happened right away. Had a patient come in confused and delirious because his kidneys were shutting down. He had multiple myeloma and a history of colon cancer, plus a bunch of other things. He was jaundiced and needed to be shocked several times. The physicians, residents, and even the family thought he was going to die. The man insisted on full measures to keep him alive. He recovered in the span of 5 days. His kidneys improved, his delirium evaporated, and the man fucking walked out of the ICU. Then there was the guy who had to be castrated, but that's another story. Guy around 50 years old had necrotizing fasciitis in his groin. He had genital warts, did not care for them. They got infected until he got septic. He came in and the surgeons had no choice but to completely castrate him along with removing a good part of the pannus there. The man was quite obese, maybe 5'9", but 350 pounds. I never saw him stand. He never spoke, never looked at the doctors, and barely ever moved. He had a lot of other problems happen later, and I was surprised to see him still alive 6 months later. His quality of life had dramatically decreased. They had to cut away dead tissue every 3 days or so. It wasn't pleasant. About 20 years ago, I had a patient come in with obstruction of his colon by a large colon cancer. The cancer had spread to his liver, and CT scan showed the liver basically replaced by metastatic tumor. So he wouldn't die on intestinal obstruction. I won't go into detail, but trust me, it is a very unpleasant way to die. The patient, his family, and I decided to try placing an expandable metal stent through the tumor. It worked. His obstruction was relieved, and he was able to go home to spend his last days with his family. 18 months later, the patient came in for an office visit for heartburn. He was even more jaundiced than when I first met him, but he felt basically well and was eating well. The stent was still functioning. I never saw him again, and assume he finally succumbed to his disease, but he got at least 18 months of precious and really good time. A patient I took care of had a car fall on his face. He was underneath it working when it slid off of the jack. The only reason he survived was because he broke every bone in his face. He had a Lefort 3, which allowed for his brain to swell. He also needed an additional surgery to relieve the pressure of cerebral edema, but the facial fractures did allow for a great deal of give in his skull. I was rotating through ICU, so I first saw him just a day after the accident. His head was so swollen he didn't even look human. Fast forward a few weeks later, I was rotating through a different unit in the hospital and came across the same patient. He was quickly recovering and had minimal neurodeficits. Not a doctor, but been a paramedic 15 years. Had an 8-year-old kid on a ripstick similar to a skateboard lose control and roll into the path of an oncoming SUV in his neighborhood. He was hit by, then run over by it. We arrived to find him face down under the vehicle, unconscious, barely breathing. After all was said and done, he had bilateral femur fractures, 1 lower leg fracture, multiple rib fractures, a blown pupil and open skull fracture, subdural brain bleed, a tension pneumo, air escaping lungs into the chest cavity, will squish the lungs and heart if untreated, and when we were bagging him, breathing for him, we felt subcutaneous emphysema, free air that crackles like Rice Krispies or bubble wrap in his hip. Yes, hip. We flew him to the children's hospital expecting him to die within the hour. He was in a coma for days and had to have multiple surgeries, but made a complete recovery, 100% neurologically intact as well, and graduates high school in the spring. His was such an amazing case, the hospital made him one of their Miracle Kids of the Year. Parents, please make your kids wear helmets, even in the neighborhood. It wouldn't have prevented all of his injuries, but would have substantially lessened the brain trauma he suffered. Not a doctor, but encountered a woman that was shot blank in the head by her boyfriend. Bullet entered one of her eye sockets and exited above her ear on the same side. She called 911 on her own and survived, was in ICU for weeks, and testified against the bastard who is now thankfully in prison. Nurse here. About a 50-year-old male came into the ER after falling and not being able to get up. His testicles were so engorged they came down to his knees, with a width about 1.5 times greater than his thigh. Penis was completely retracted into his scrotum. Had a CT scan that showed his entire large intestine, most of his small intestine, and his pancreas had herniated into his scrotum. You could auscultate his bowel sounds through his balls. The surgeon said she had never seen anything like this, and that it takes months to get that way, and only happens in third world countries with poor or no access to medical care. She couldn't do much because his diaphragm had been so accustomed to the altered space in his abdomen, that if she put his organs back in his abdominal cavity, he wouldn't be able to breathe independently, would need to be ventilated permanently. The poor guy had mental health issues, I believe schizophrenia, which is why he was in the condition he was in. He was still able to pee all by himself. Third time I post this story, but copy-paste from myself. Story time. First, some backstory. In Brazil, you can to internship way earlier than in most of America and Europe med schools, so keep that in mind. I was in my 4th year of med school and in the first day as an intern in a trauma hospital after training. There was a bus crash right before, so all the staff was occupied when a woman came in screaming, "I'm going to die! I got shot in the head!" When I look up, I see a really thin woman, deep eyes, white as snow skin, with a bullet hole in the center of her forehead. She told us she owed money to a drug dealer and he put a gun against his head, shot, and ran. Now, I believe because she has burn marks and gunpowder right there on her skin and a hole. Now, remind that I am a student and there was no available doctors in the moment, so I run to my professor, that was with another patient, and tell her the story, and also that she is lucid with normal life signs, and get an order to do a CT scan. The CT shows that the bullet entered the forehead through the first layer of the frontal bone, but not the second, and headed down through her palatus and stopped at a vertebrae, C5 if I recall correctly. No brain damage at all. So we intern her and a tracheostomy is put in place, along with the emergency reconstructive surgery, only a first, not definitive approach, along with a cervical collar. After she is stable, 3 hours later in the room, 3rd floor, we go down to see other patients. The emergency then gets a call. "Hello, we are from the X hospital, 20 kilometers away from ours, and we found a patient of yours in our emergency." Then the nurses on the floor realized she was missing. She jumped a 3rd-story floor, broke her ankle, and got in the buses and went to the other hospital. Why? I saw him in there. He came to finish the job. And before you ask, yes, some people lost their jobs. If you enjoyed this week's effective way to waste time, hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. If you are enjoying the series, leave me a comment below. A special shout out to the content creators. You frickin' rock.